A lot of people get into Scientology, or at least they're disseminated Scientology at kind of like a low point in their life, or kind of a stage in their life where maybe things aren't so good. And for me, it was actually the exact opposite. I got into Scientology probably at the a peak. You know, life is full of peaks and valleys, but I think it was definitely a peak for me financially, emotionally, spiritually, mentally, physically. I mean, all these different things in my life. It was really like a really wonderful time for me. I had just shut down a very successful business. I was just about to turn 30. I had really no ties. I was going to do some traveling. And I basically, you know, I got contacted by the Boston organization. And I had actually been interested a few years prior to in the Purification rundown. And somehow or another, they lured me in there. And that's when it started. It was around Christmas, New Year's of 2009 is when I started in Scientology. So my initial introduction or foray into Scientology was for the Purification rundown, simply because I was interested in physical health. I was interested in detoxification, just kind of my natural inclination towards very healthy living and, you know, eating certain things and living a certain way. So yeah, that's how I got in initially. Scientology tends to do this thing where everything works for everybody. And they try to simplify human beings and simplify situations. So for someone like me who's like in pretty good shape and takes care of themselves, being in a sauna for a few hours a day isn't a big deal. I mean, I can handle that. But I think for other people, maybe it could be really a significant health risk. So my personal experience in the Purif was actually positive, but I could imagine how a lot of people, it wouldn't be positive. So, and that's one of the basic problems with Scientology is they think everything works for everybody, especially Scientology. And that's just not the case, and it's a falsehood, and their means of selling that service is totally dishonest and not based in fact. When I was in the Purif, I was reading a succession of Scientology literature, listened to tapes, and like, you know, this kind of idea of like the love bombing started, where like all the organization would come in and tell me how great I was, and, you know, so on and so forth. And they knew that I was financially independent, and they knew that I could, if I wanted to, I could pay the whole bridge that day. You know what I mean? So what happened was I decided to buy a package of 12 intensives, which is 144 hours of auditing. So I did that, and then I started the process of going up through the grades with a Class 6 auditor at the Boston organization.
How much did that cost?
That was, I think, about $28,000. Yeah.
This is not a poor man's religion.
No, it's not. This is another interesting thing that I actually like to give a side comment on. Scientology, it's really fascinating because the philosophy is a poor man's philosophy. See, Scientology is not an intellectually, I wouldn't call it stimulating. You know, like L. Ron Hubbard wasn't Hegel or Kant or any of these brilliant writers on metaphysics. He was a guy from the outback of Montana who, yeah, he was a smart guy, but he was certainly not an academic. So it's really interesting that people say Scientology is like a rich man's religion. It's a poor man's religion that costs a lot of money, which is really interesting because Scientology, I mean, you very rarely find, in the beginning you did, right? You find a lot of really kind of intellectual people that were interested in, you know, like Huxley was interested in, Burroughs was interested in. And, you know, maybe if it was run like a nice organization today, maybe there would be some really smart people interested in it right now. But Scientology it's a really interesting dichotomy. It's a poor man's religion that costs a lot of money. Because Hubbard, basically what he did is he simplified these complex truths in a way that's digestible for somebody that has no background in metaphysical training or spiritual understanding. And he makes these simple things like be, do, have, or the dynamics, or ARC, these things that are, you know, fairly easily digestible for somebody who hasn't been exposed to any theological or spiritual tradition. Yet it costs a lot of money, you know, which is the total ironic thing about Scientology. So yeah, to answer your question, it's not a poor man's religion financially, but I think it could be introduced that way to somebody who doesn't have, let's say, high levels of training in different things. As I look back at it, I have a little different experience of it as I look back at it now, but in the moment I was kind of caught up in this idea that, you know, like the human potential or some kind of enlightenment process was happening. And I did feel like I was making some gains. I did feel like I was, you know, handling some issues that may have hampered me in my life. And more than that, I felt like the people in the Boston organization themselves were actually nice people. You know what I mean? I felt like I couldn't believe that these people worked for like $50 a week and were doing all these amazing things. So I had a lot of respect for the work they were doing. And I did feel like in a weird, I mean, you know, I was obviously aware that it was very expensive. And so I guess it was that part of it that kind of hooked me, like I was going to get something even more than, you know, there was always kind of a carrot, you know what I mean? But yeah, overall things went good because that's when I decided to go down to Flag because it was going well. You know, I didn't decide to go to Flag because I was in this, you know, terrible situation and I was being abused daily. I decided to go to Flag because I felt like I was making progress in my own path. The experience at Flag was overall torturous from the first day to the last day. And I was at Flag for approximately 7 months, 6, 7 months. And I spent the whole time trying to undo the torture. You know, I spent the whole time trying to figure out if I had caused the mental torture, or they had caused it, or what was going on. But I would say the incredible difference between the general attitude and the way human beings are treated at the Boston organization versus how they're treated at the Flag organization was incredibly tangible, incredibly obvious, and also incredibly sad. Looking back on it, like the head organization of this religion is so inhumane versus a low organization that is more humane. I wouldn't even call them humane at this point. I would just call them more humane than their kind of like mothership.
Well, what do you mean by inhumane?
What do I mean by inhumane? I mean inhumane, I mean an incessant and nonstop need for money. That in and of itself I thought was inhumane. A consistent series of very subtle invalidations and very subtle criticisms of who I was as a human being and what I was doing with my life.
Give me an example.
I'll give you a few examples, but I mean one of the most examples, and I think back in the fact that I didn't like walk up and leave that day, was when Dave Foster, who was a registrar at the Flag organization, who I actually liked. You know, he was an interesting guy. He went to Dartmouth. He had this really interesting past. And he was trying to reg me to buy my whole bridge. And I had said to him, he had been doing it for like a week or so every day. And I finally said, Dave, you know something, I'm not going to do it. I'll do it when I'm ready. And he called me a fucking asshole. He's like, you're a fucking asshole, Brian. And I was just kind of like, whoa, did you just really say that? You know? And, you know, one of the things that's interesting about Flag, too, I have never in my life, you know, and I'm a guy I've lived in different countries, I've seen a lot at a young age. I have never heard an organization in and of itself use profanity and four-letter words more than, it's like, you know, a collection of truck drivers that work at the Flag Service Organization. I mean, from the 15-year-old girl to the, I mean, I've never heard more F words in my life. So him saying the F word wasn't surprising, but the way he directed it at me as a very personal, you know, you're a fucking asshole, that was a little surprising that day. So, I mean, and that was really the least of I mean, in many ways, I actually appreciated the honesty of that. You know, there was far more very subtle ways of invalidating me as a human being that I really didn't even pick up on because it was happening at like in such a way that I didn't quite get it. You know what I mean? So I think that my entire experience there, not only the actual process of me doing auditing, which was really, really painful, very traumatic actually, but also the various kind of like social elements, the financial element, and overall just kind of like being lost in this maze, in this like mental maze that I didn't even know I was in. You know what I mean? I knew there was something wrong, and I knew that I didn't feel good, and I knew that my intuition, but I was still going over I was still using the idea that it was my fault, that I must have done something wrong for this to happen, you know? A basic Scientology kind of philosophical underpinning, I guess, is this idea that if you're part of a group and you leave the group suddenly, right, then you must have committed some kind of crime or some kind of wrongful action within the context of the group. And you know something? It's really interesting because at the time, I thought that made sense, and I thought there was some rationality to that. And then I went back and I thought of this example that I use for people, and it's like, imagine if you were in a restaurant, and imagine if you ordered something and the price was more than what you paid for. For instance, like you ordered chicken and it said on the menu 20, but they actually charged you 25. Not only that, but the chicken tasted horrible. And not only that, the entire staff consistently invalidated you and said things about you and didn't treat you like a patron. And then when you get up to leave the restaurant, they all get around you and say, hey, what did you do? Because no one leaves this place without, the only people who leave this restaurant are people who do bad things. That's Scientology. And that's the trap that they get people into. And that's the trap. So you have all these people who are eating food, you know, metaphorically speaking. The food doesn't taste good. The food's overpriced. The waiters and the chefs are treating them horribly. And then they want to get up and leave, and they feel like they can't because they've been taught that anyone who leaves a restaurant, they must have done something wrong. So, and there are people, Mark, in this situation for 30 years. 30 years. I mean, I was in this situation for a few months, but even in the beginning, I knew there was something wrong, but I was willing to give it some time to explore it, you know? And then I got to the point where it was just too crazy. It was too, it was violating too many of my personal principles that I was just like, this is totally crazy.
I find it interesting that in Scientology, if something doesn't work,
yeah,
you did something wrong.
Yeah, it's interesting. And then, you know, when you try to turn it around on them, you know, for instance, because like one of the things that I did is I said a couple of times, well, if it's not working for me and you're the auditor, it's not working for you either. So what did you do wrong? And they didn't like that at all. You know what I mean? Because, you know, it's like a two-way flow. And I said that a couple of times. And I said, well, what did you do? Because it's not working for you either. Because working for you is me being happy and me having a good experience. And the woman was like, oh, well, I don't know. And I said, well, you should think about that maybe. And that didn't go over good. I had to go see ethics, you know, for something like that. But, you know, that reasoning it's so like, you know, rhetorically easily beatable. Could you just throw right back to them? Well, it's not working for you either. So what do? You know what I mean? And the danger with that is that once you start to speak directly against the organization, you can get yourself in trouble. So people just go along with it, you know what I mean? Because they have so much time and money and family and different relational ties associated with the organization that they can't get out.
What happens if you get in ethics trouble?
I don't know, because I was never in too much ethics trouble. I was in a little ethics trouble for being PTS a couple times. They tried to say I was PTS because I wasn't happy with the auditing, you know, so they tried to find some kind of person who was antagonistic to me. And, you know, I think back at it now, I was PTS to these people. You know what I mean? Like the whole organization was basically suppressing and invalidating me as a human being. And because of that, I wasn't making progress, and I wasn't, you know, happy, and I wasn't, you know, experiencing all these things that myself as a human being is able to experience.
Could you explain PTS?
Yeah, sure. So PTS is an acronym for potential trouble source. And what that basically means is a person is potentially a trouble source if they're connected to an individual who is actively antagonizing, harming, or suppressing their life. And when you're connected to somebody like that, you become what the church refers to as PTS, or somebody who is potentially a trouble source. So this is like a huge item in Scientology. Everybody's PTS. We got to find PTS, and that, you know, it's like this medieval wild goose chase for, like, you know, people who are speaking out against the Catholic Church. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, it's totally crazy, and it's this kind of like, and it's getting to the point now. It got to the point when I was there where it's like, you know, being PTS was like being like a leper. You know what I mean? It was like kind of like this crazy. This crazy kind of association that it would be like, oh my God, PTS, oh my God, you know what I mean? And I think that's really interesting, you know, because you're allegedly or supposedly engaging in this philosophy that's supposed to totally free you from all these situations and experiences and relationships that are supposed to kind of like unleash, you know, your potential as a human being. And here everyone is, the whole organization, just horrified of this possibility that you could be connected to somebody who's antagonistic. And one of the things that's so interesting, I think, too, is when they try to have you find the person who's antagonizing you, they always, this is really interesting, is that they always try to, like you don't know who it is. You know what I mean? It's like for me, it's like if somebody's antagonizing my life, it's pretty obvious. You know what I mean? I know they're doing it to me. But they try to make it like this secret thing where like they might be doing it to you in a way you don't know what's happening. So you really have to like find. So it makes you like churn these mental wheels incessantly. I mean, I was to the point where I was like, is my mother doing this to me? Is my father doing this to me? And my parents have been nothing but supporters to me my whole life and everything I've done. And I was to the point where I was actually considering the fact that they were like these evil people my whole life and I didn't know they were. You know what I mean? So they have this amazing ability to get you to consider that there are people in your life that have never hurt you are actually secretly plotting your destruction.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
Conversely, the only people you can trust
are them. Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely an us versus them mentality once you get into the organization. And I think that's a really sad thing because, we live in the information age. I mean, we live in like the postmodern world where information is everywhere. It's free and it's changing. You know what I mean? So here you have this philosophy that's stuck in the 1960s. It's not changing because, and I don't even know if Hubbard himself, I actually think Hubbard himself would want it to evolve, but I think the organization has put any stop on any like development of the technology, any new kind of philosophical streams to inject into the philosophy, and they're stuck. And in this day and age, that is like the opposite of what's happening on planet Earth. I mean, it's really exciting to be alive on planet Earth. There's so many things happening in terms of technology, spirituality. All these different things are growing and changing at such a rapid rate with the internet. And here you have Scientology that's just stuck in 1962. And we know the answers, and we're not changing, and this is how it is. And you see why their numbers are declining, and you see why people are leaving, and you see why, and not only that, but you have this terrible abuse that the organization is engaging on a daily basis, human rights, financial, all these different actions that they're taking on that are legitimate abuse of human beings, coupled with their totally backwards philosophy. It's no wonder why it's a dying organization.
You talk about the information age. When you're there at the Fort Harrison,
yeah,
are you able to hop on the net,
yeah,
look at the outside world?
Yeah, you are, but you're not allowed to hop on the net to look on anything about Scientology. You know what I mean? But you are. Yeah, there's internets there that you can look on. The actual staff members can't, but public are fine. I mean, there's free Wi-Fi and everything like that in the hotel. When I was down there, there was an article in the Drudge Report. I was on the Drudge Report one day reading something, and there was an article about Scientology. I forget what it was, but it was something, and I clicked on it, and I said to somebody, "Oh, said this really horrible thing about Scientology on the internet." I go, "What were you reading that for?" I said, "It was on the front page of the Drudge Report." And I was reading the Drudge Report, and I don't know what it was. It was CNN or something like that, but yeah. So I got in trouble for that. They just asked, "Why did you click on it? What did it say? Did you tell anybody? Did you talk about it with anybody?" Stuff like that. So it was basically like a very subtle inquisition of the actual. And for me, it wasn't even a big deal because at that point I was still, willing to trust the organization and believe that what I read was false. Yeah, so they by their own actions pushed me further away. Like for me, I read it. I didn't hide it. I said to them, I read it, And then there was this kind of like, inquisition into my life. And then I was like, whoa, what's going on right now? And then from that experience made me realize that, whatever.
So the quality of auditing, you said, was troubling at Flag. How was it different from what you had in Boston?
I think the main difference was just the care of the people. You know what I mean? And I think that's what auditing or any therapeutic process is. That you have two people, one person who's the practitioner, the psychologist, or the auditor, and the other person who's the student or the patient or the pre-clear. And I think in any situation, when the person who's engaging in the therapeutic act has care and respect and honors the process, then good things happen, no matter what it is, auditing or not auditing. So I think in Boston, I found that there was a genuine care for me processing, doing the actions in Scientology, whereas at Flag, there was there was very little care. And every time I walked out of the auditing room, there was 3 people looking for me. 1 to have me join the Sea Org, 1 to have me donate money to the IIS, maybe 4. 1 to have me donate money to Superpower, 1 to have me donate money to Planetary Dissemination, 1 to have me donate money to Ideal Orgs, 1 to have me buy the bridge. So there was, at any given time, there was 1 of 6 people looking for me the moment I walked out. And it's really interesting because they coordinate it. You know what I mean? So like, for instance, the IIS, they'll call the person who's in charge of the auditor and say, hey, is Joe Smith out of session yet? And they'll look and say, oh, he'll be out in 10 minutes. All right, good, I'll go up and meet him. So they have this whole thing kind of worked out where the people are like waiting for people. And it's actually to the point where they know if the session went good or not. You know, so it's like they know if somebody had a really good session and they, you know, maybe had some kind of experience that could be conceived like a kind of a spiritual epiphany or some kind of awakening, that this would be a good time to get money from them. You know what I mean? So they have this whole thing worked out, which is just like, yeah, it's sickening. You know what I mean? It's beyond sickening.
Would they know that before you actually left the audit?
Yeah, I found that afterwards, yeah. Not before they left the auditing room, but they would talk to the, there would be some kind of dialogue between what's called the tech services and the IAS people. So the tech services would be the people that coordinate with the auditor to get the pre-clearance session. And they would know the situation just based upon what the pre-care looks like or what they're talking about. And they could go back, oh, he looks really happy. You should go get some, you know, kind of like that.
Well, they wouldn't necessarily know details of your auditing.
No. They wouldn't know any details other than the fact that Joe Smith just walked out of the auditing session and he's beaming. And he has this big smile on his face and he's talking to everybody and, you know, things look really good for Joe Smith. You should go talk to him. Yeah, there would be no details, but there would be kind of a perception of him as a human being and what he, I mean, auditing is actually quite powerful when it's done correctly. And there's no question in my mind that even though I don't think it's necessarily the best therapeutic approach, it's definitely a beautiful way for people to potentially, you know, engage in some kind of healing practice. And there's no question that it can have these big, huge kind of like effects where people can walk out of a room and go, whoa, I feel incredibly alive right now. I feel incredibly happy right now, something like that. So anybody could see that effect on a person and run back and say, hey, Joe Smith's looking pretty good right now. You might want to go talk to him and see if he wants to donate some money. So yeah, I mean, it's truly, truly sickening the way they manipulate that situation. The person who signed me up for service as a flag was a guy named Charlie Bills, who apparently is like this old kind of like, you know, war veteran of Scientology who's been around for a long time. And it's kind of funny because he would say to me, literally, before I went there, don't give anyone any money. You know what I mean? He would actually say this in those direct words. Don't give anyone any money. So it's interesting because the first day I got there, I was supposed to get picked up by the flag kind of like hotel bus, the Port Harrison bus. So I get off the plane, and I remember I had a connection in Charlotte that day. It was Boston, Charlotte, Tampa. And I got off the plane and I go down to get my bags, and I'm waiting in line to get my bags, and all of a sudden someone says, hey, Brian. And I turn around and it's like this 16-year-old girl, 17-year-old girl. And I was just like, yeah? And she was like, hey, I'm here to pick you up. And I'm like, you're here to pick me up? I'm like, do you have a license? You know, kind of kidding around. And then some other older guy she was with. And it was interesting, she was his boss, which I found really fascinating. She was like a 16-year-old girl, and he was like a 50-year-old man, and she was his boss, which is actually really common in Scientology, which actually is kind of cool, you know what I mean? Which is kind of interesting that they don't pay attention to.
What's the rationale behind that?
The rationale, I should say that I don't think that's necessarily cool, but I think the fact that they overdo it, but the fact that like age and sex never played a role in Hubbard's thinking of who should be responsible in an organization, which I actually think was actually somewhat forward thinking. Now I don't mean kids, but I mean like if there's a 20-year-old woman who's as good as a 50-year-old guy, Hubbard would say 20-year-old woman's going to do it because she's better, you know what I mean? And I thought that was somewhat admirable of him in terms of his ability to see through cultural and sexual and social restrictions that were really in place in the 60s, that he saw right through that. But anyway, the point being is that this young woman and this guy come to pick me up, And they are from the Superpower Project. And they knew I was coming, and they knew I was coming to do my L's. So they say, we're here to pick you up and give you a ride. And I say, okay, fine. So we get in the car, and the whole car ride from Tampa to Clearwater, which is about a 25-minute drive, it's incessant, nonstop badgering for money for the Superpower Project. And I get this full rundown of what it is. And it's interesting. It's 2012 now. This is 2009. It was going to be open in 3 months, and they needed the money. It's 3 years later. It's not open. You know what I mean? Which I find kind of interesting. And they were using the line that it's going to be open in a few months. We need this money to open it, and blah, blah, blah. So they wanted $35,000. I gave them, I think, $5,000 in the car ride. And then I get out of the car, and I had prepaid for like 3 months of living in the Fort Harrison Hotel. And I think I was like $1,000 short. And there was like a representative for the hotel who was standing, who literally opened the door for me. It was like, where's $1,000? You know? So I gave him $1,000 cash. And then an hour later, I'm in Dave Foster's office getting regged for my entire bridge, which was like $150,000. So I mean, and this never stopped though, Mark. I mean, this was like, you know, basically from the day I got there to the day I left, there were 7 people asking me for money the whole time. Every day, nonstop. And it sounds almost like so amazing that no one can believe it, but I know someone like you who's been around can easily believe it. You know, and I know that any person I've ever talked to about Scientology was like, oh, I've gotten worse than that. You know what I mean? So it's really kind of like culture. It's institutionalized in the culture. It's part of the culture. It's institutionalized where asking for money is totally normal, and being made to feel wrong and being made to feel like you're not doing enough or not giving money, it's totally normal. It's just how it is, you know? And for me, because I had no experience, I mean, I didn't grow up in Scientology. I'd been in the church for a few months. To me, this was like totally foreign. And here I am thinking, wow, is this the way the world really is supposed to work? Is this how I'm supposed to feel? So, you know, one of the things that's really interesting for me too is that you really begin to question your own kind of like moral compass and your own sense of ethics and your own sense of value, your own sense of values, you know what I mean? In a way that is very powerful, where you really question these like fundamental core principles that you have as a human being. And it becomes very shaky, you know what I mean? Because you're around all these people, and this is the thing, you have, you know, at Flag you have thousands of people all kind of questioning their own, but you can't share that information with anybody. It's a secret. So you have like thousands of people with a dirty little secret that no one's talking about, you know, and that's the real tragedy of the whole thing, is that I don't think for a second that there's a person inside of Scientology that doesn't know in some way, deep inside of them, that there's a part of what they're doing. I mean, you know, because I'm not one of these people that think, oh, the whole thing's evil, the whole thing's wrong. I mean, I totally get that they do some good things in the world. And I totally get that some of the things they do is good. But the problem with that is that behind the good thing, there's this monster. You know what I mean? And that takes away from the good thing. So people say, oh, we do all these things for human rights. And okay, yeah, you do. And that's great. Those videos are good and the actions you do are good. But it doesn't matter, because behind it, it's all these lies and deceit, and the organization itself is monstrous. So those good deeds don't mean anything. You know what I mean? And this is what they don't get. So I mean, I definitely understand that there's a segment of the population within Scientology that does do good things. I saw it with my own eyes. There's no question about it. But the problem is they haven't had the ability to fully see the full scope of what's happening in the organization. That all these good deeds are like for naught. I mean, and they're really for naught. You know what I mean? And that's the real tragedy, because, you know, if you had an organization, whether or not you find the philosophy of Scientology sound or not, if you had an organization that was just good, it would be a big difference. You know what I mean, in terms of how things would be handled. You know. If
you were troubled by these regges or whatever, you couldn't talk to other people about it, could you?
No, no. So you can't. You can write it up to the organization, and you can talk directly. The organization is actually pretty. They don't do anything, but they're pretty open. If you have a problem, you can go and talk to somebody. Nothing happens. You know what I mean? And they don't do anything, but they do set it up where you can always write what's called a knowledge report, or you can always write something. But what is forbidden is talking to other parishioners about your problems. That is like totally wrong, because for them that's like it's not they say it's not the appropriate channel, which to me is just a way of like creating, you know, like a police state. You know what I mean? That's what it really is. It's like this really kind of religious police state where you're not allowed to have free-flowing, you know, authentic. I mean, you're not allowed to be a human being. You know what I mean? And that's the thing. It's, you know, Scientology. Because Scientology presupposes that people aren't necessarily human beings. They're spiritual beings living inside of having a human experience. Now, for me, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think people have a spiritual basis, but I mean, they have this like certainty that you're a spiritual being, and which I think, you know, I don't know if I necessarily think that. But it's interesting because Scientology is actually a very anti-human religion. They look at human beings in and of themselves as being very bad. And the only thing that's good is this kind of abstract thetan, this abstract entity that you truly are and I truly am, that's living this kind of fake human life. So these human qualities of like saying you're hurt or saying you're angry or saying being a real human, to Scientology, that's really bad. You know, so it's like it's a very anti-humanist organization, and it's a very anti-humanist organization, and I think maybe philosophically there are portions of both, you know, humanistic in a good way and very, you know, Hubbard definitely said some things that were very disparaging and anti-human beings, you know what I mean? But yeah, I mean, Scientology kills human beings. That's what it does.
Other than the non-stop regging, what is it like to live at the Fort Harrison Hotel for months on end?
Very luxurious, very, very nice. Food is good, rooms are beautiful, atmosphere is nice. But, well, I think, you know, I can only speak for myself. You know, my experience of living there, because my experience inside of the actual, you know, like the auditing situation and the different things I was doing was so traumatic that the experience in the hotel was not good, you know. So yeah, I mean, I had a horrible experience living in the hotel.
You're aware that the staff was earning $50 a week. Were you at all aware of the rest of the treatment that Sea Org members?
No, definitely not. I knew they were getting $50 a week, and I knew that was like, but for me, like, I had a lot of respect for that. You know what I mean? For me, that was like, wow, these people are like, you know. But I also knew they had their housing and their food covered and everything like that. But see, the Sea Org member will never tell you that they're being treated badly. I mean, that would be like, I mean, I couldn't even imagine being at the, you know, at the Fort Harrison Hotel and the Sea Org member saying, God, we're like, they treat us so bad here. They make it seem like everything is like just beautiful and wonderful, and you know, nothing can be better. So for me as a parishioner, I'm thinking, wow, these guys, you know, maybe I should join the Sea Org. You know what I mean?
Why did you decide to leave?
Well, I mean, I kind of had like a straw that broke the camel's back experience, but I think it was just the, you know, aggregation of 6 months of torture. You know what I mean? That I was just kind of like, there's no possible way that I can be part of this group. And I think that the thing for me, more than anything, was just like, there is no way I could ever get somebody to come down here. Like, there was no way that I could ever call like my brother or call a friend and say, hey, come down to the Scientology place and you know, whatever. To me, that would be like a crime, you know what I mean? So that's the reason why, for me, I decided to finally leave, because I realized that for me to call somebody and say, hey, come down to this place and, you know, explore this philosophy, I would be worried sick about them all night. I would be like, oh my God, are they hurting them? Are they taking money from them? Are they going to do something to them? So that was just like the litmus test for me, is I could never in a million years get somebody to go into Scientology, ever. Because to me, I'd be worried about them. And this isn't to say I don't think there are things in Scientology that are beneficial. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that the organizational responsible for making this philosophical system come into action is toxic, is dangerous, is psychotic, is schizophrenic. I didn't even tell anybody I was in Scientology. I didn't even tell my friends. I mean, my family knew a little bit. But I mean, this wasn't something that I actively spoke about because I wasn't sure, I wasn't certain myself yet. And the moment I became certain about the situation, I was gone. You know what I mean? So if I was certain that this was like a really good organization, then of course I tell people, what's there to be ashamed of? But for me, a lot of the process was figuring out if it's good or not. You know what I mean? And then when I finally figured out that the whole thing was essentially, a scam, that I left, I don't necessarily think aspects of the philosophy are scamish. I think there are aspects of the philosophy that are definitely scamish, and I think the organization as a whole is a total scam. So I think that the way the organization operates itself, the leadership of the organization, their methodology of extracting money from people, the misinformation and the propaganda that they use to talk about the things they're doing in the world, the general statistics of the organization, how it's perceived, by the globe, those things are patently false, lies, total misrepresentation of the truth. Now, when you see, in Scientology, there's two things. There's the philosophy and the organization, right? So the organization we can just classify as totally bad. See, this is the thing about the philosophy of Scientology is that for me, like, I very rarely heard people talk intelligently and effectively about the philosophy of Scientology, okay? You have, in the philosophy of Scientology, which is essentially the collection of lectures and writings of L. Ron Hubbard, you have something that's literally 50 times the size of the Bible, maybe 100 times the size of the Bible. So let's take the Bible for example. There is absolutely these transcendent, beautiful lines of Christ, or these lines in the Old Testament that are beautiful, talking about the nature of human existence. And there's also these crazy lines in the Old Testament about stoning women and all these horrible things. So do we say that the Judeo-Christian tradition is all wrong? Of course not. Think about the thought leaders, just like Saint Anselm and all these brilliant people that have developed, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Copernicus, all these people that developed their thought from that tradition. Now, I'm definitely not even close to comparing Scientology to that, but it's the same thing in some ways, that you have this huge body of knowledge. Of course there's some good things. Of course there's some bad things. Of course. Now, the organization tries to do this thing, well, everything is good. And you have some people, everything is bad. And they're both wrong. There's some good things, there's some bad things. But the problem is the organization is so bad that the philosophy at this point is worthless. I mean, at this point, the philosophy is junk. There's just no point with it because the organization has poisoned. If there was any good in it, it's gone. It's gone.
Do you think somebody could take the good and jettison the bad and somehow reform Scientology?
Yeah, it'd be very tricky. I mean, I believe anything's possible. It'd be very, very tricky. But yeah, sure. If somebody wanted to do that, it's possible. They'd have to take a real honest look at the OT levels. They'd have to take a real honest look about the clear, because I don't think like clear as a state, Hubbard described, exists at all. I think that they'd have to take, I think there are definitely some good things, but they'd have to be really honest about how that would work. You know what I mean? I think from the beginning, the organization, based upon what I've read and people I've talked to, was never really open to any type of outside influence, critique, modification, scientific test, any type of methodology that would influence what was happening internally. And that just, that has never worked. You know what I mean? That has never worked as a paradigm of organizational growth, organizational development, and it never will. So that's kind of one of the unfortunate things about Scientology. If somebody was to undertake some kind of reform effort and use the tactics that are already instilled, it's not going to work. So there has to be some major, major, major changes on the way people think in the organization. You know what I mean? So that's my feeling. One of the classic kind of linguistic mazes of Scientology is this idea of OT7, this idea of being cause over matter, energy, space, and time. Now that in of itself is just, basically, kind of like a delusion in and of itself. But one of the things I always find interesting is like Scientology has this thing on clearing words, right? You understand what a word is, and then from that, you have a conceptual grasp, and then you can apply it. So here, your cause over matter, right? Okay. So if you're cause over matter, you should be able to do pretty amazing things with your body, right? Handstands, headstands, you know, all these type of fluid movements. I mean, most OTAs I know can't touch their toes. The higher up you get, the worse it gets.
How far did you get up the bridge?
I got up to clear, and I actually completed the highest thing on the bridge you can, is the L's. You know what I mean? The L's are technically higher than the OT levels. So the L's stand for list. List 10, list 11, list 12. There are a series of like really advanced processes that Hubbard developed in, I think, 73, I think, when he was on the ship in the Mediterranean. So what it is, it's you know, the L's I wouldn't, see, Scientology isn't necessarily therapy. You know what I mean? It's processes to awaken and to improve human ability. So I think like the difference between like, you know, going into therapy and like with an analyst or a psychologist is very different. Like the goal is very different. And the L's are like the hyper version of that philosophy, is that they're exclusively for like the rapid unleashing of somebody's innate potential or something to that effect. So what they are basically is a series of questions very similar to any other kind of auditing. Of all three, the L10 questions are definitely the most interesting, because L10 deals with what Hubbard referred to as whole track overts. So these are things in past lives that you've done that would be considered like a sin in the Judeo-Christian traditions, like bad things you've done in past lives. So the questions are very direct, very like, I don't even know what I don't remember, like, have you ever killed anybody? Have you ever raped anybody? Have you ever, you know, stuff like that. And expressed and phrased and kind of like grammatically structured in a variety of ways.
Did you go through sec checks?
I did one sec check at the end before I left. Yeah, yeah.
How long did that take?
That lasted maybe 2 or 3 days, I think. 3 or 4 days. It was just a short one. It was like a tailor-made, maybe like 10 questions. Yeah, because basically what happened was that I was like complaining and saying, this isn't really, like, I don't really want to be here anymore towards the end. So their solution was, Brian must have done something wrong, let's sec check him. So it's funny, you know, I left at the end of the sec check, I was like, peace out, guys, you know, I'm out of here. So most of the times what they do it does the opposite effect, you know what I mean? So, yeah. You know, one of the things too that Hubbard's, you know, one of Hubbard's basic principles in terms of management was this idea of managing by statistics, or using quantification to manage human subjectivity. And I find it so interesting because you can turn that back on Scientology so easily. The Boston organization, this is a perfect example. The Boston organization has, on a really good day, I'll give them 400 parishioners. They really have about 200, but let's just say 400, okay? The Boston organization has 200,000 files of people who had been either bought books there, did a service there, or did something like that. Now you look at the statistics of 200,000 divided by 400. I mean, what is that percentage-wise? Not very high. It's less than 1%. So, you know, this tells you the effectiveness of Scientology. And this tells you, using Hubbard's own methods, using quantifying human interaction, human experience, you know, according to Hubbard, is the way to manage people. So you take that, you look at the Boston org as a case study, Scientology is worthless. It doesn't work. It's horrible. 99% of the people that go in the door don't come back. Now, they will never, ever even think about going there, ever, which is sad, which is dishonest, which is not living up to the ideals of what a religion should live up to, is honest, open communication, transparency, all these things.
What do you think about L. Ron Hubbard?
Fascinating. One of the most fascinating human beings I've ever read about, and I'm like really big on biographies. I love reading about people, historical figures. Fascinating guy. I think that he was a tortured soul. I think that he was simultaneously a sinner and a saint, you know what I mean? And simultaneously I definitely don't think Hubbard was all bad. Definitely not. I think because I actually spent some time with Ken Urquhart, who was Hubbard's kind of top lieutenant, who lives in Western Mass, old British guy. I spent some time with him, and very, very, very sane, rational, intelligent guy who told me a lot of personal stories about how Hubbard treated him and treated different people. And it's the same thing. It's like he could be the most loving, charming, wonderful person, and he could be absolutely horrible, scary, you know? So I think he was, like most very successful people, extremely complex, extremely volatile, very, very intelligent, obviously, do what he did, very extremely creative. One of the things I like about Hubbard the most, he was very creative. You know, he was an amazing mind in terms of his writing, in terms of, you know, just inventing Scientology off the cuff the way he did. His photography, I mean, he did a lot of other things too that I think was really interesting. So yeah, I mean, my opinion on Hubbard is he's an interesting guy. Good guy or bad guy, don't know. Interesting, very captivating, very, very, very American. L. Ron Hubbard is very American. You know what I mean? Scientology is a very American religion. It came from the West, from like, you know, you think about Hubbard, he grew up in Montana, you know what I mean? He grew up in like, as the West was kind of dying, you know what I mean? So I think a lot of the lectures and a lot of the ideology of Scientology of kind of like fighting back and like being like this pioneer, and a lot of those things came from his own psychology of growing up in kind of like a very kind of dangerous and kind of barren land, and represented by this spirit that was kind of imbued in the American West at that time as it was dying out, you know what I mean? As it was being kind of, industry was going there and all these different things. So I think you can see a lot of that in the philosophy of Scientology as being like a phenomenon of like some kind of American Western ideology. It's interesting. I mean, you know, you might be stretching with that, but I think you can definitely find a lot of correlations between the system he developed and kind of how he grew up and his own upbringing and his own, I mean, you think about his life, it's just so amazing. I mean, you know, traveling through Asia and all these different things. It's really, and obviously I know that he embellished a lot of the things, but even if he didn't embellish it, it's still pretty amazing. I mean, I think the real story is just as good as the embellished story, and that's the thing that people don't, and that's the real sad thing, you know what I mean? That even if you lied about some stuff, his life in and of itself was amazing.
To me, Hubbard was a deeply flawed man.
Deeply, yeah. But we all are, though. I'm deeply flawed. Right. And I think being a human being, you have to be flawed to be a human being. And that's the simultaneous beauty and terror of living. You know what I mean?
What's remarkable to me, though, is this deeply flawed man said that he had the answers to make you this superior person without flaws. Yeah. And yet it couldn't help him. Yeah.
Well, I think it did help him in some ways. I think that, see, this is the thing about auditing, is that it's very like this. You know what I mean? You have this incredible experience where all of a sudden you're up in the clouds and you're writing poetry and you're kind of like, whoa, you know what I mean? Like you see the beauty in life, and then a month later you're like crashing, you know what I mean? So I think Hubbard definitely had those experiences when he was getting audited or doing something within Scientology, and would have these beautiful kind of awakenings to different parts of himself or his psychology that he could create better. And I truly think that in those moments what he was saying was authentic. And then comes the downside, right? The dark side, the hangover, you know what I mean, from the spiritual awakening. And a lot of those things that he thought about or talked about didn't have the same effect. So I also think, though, that like a lot of flawed people try to do I think that's why most people that do amazing things are very, very flawed, because they are so flawed internally that they have to project it externally and rise above it. I mean, when you read the history, there's a great book called The Intellectuals by Paul Johnson, and it gives kind of a biography of Rousseau, Sartre, Marx, Hemingway, you know, like 10 different people. I mean, you talk about flawed. I mean, you talk about crazy. I mean, all these people had these incredible personal problems, yet at the same time they could write and think and create these amazing, beautiful works. So for me, most people in life who do great things are really, really messed up. So I mean, it doesn't surprise me at all that Hubbard was messed up. And I think, and this is the thing about Scientology that to me is like so heartbreaking, is that like they distance themselves from the messed upness that we all are. Like a Scientologist will never admit that they have any problems. they'll never admit that they have like an emotional weakness or some kind of, to them it's like wrong to admit any type of weakness. And I think that's where people's fundamental strength comes from, by realizing how weak we are, but also how strong we are at the same time. And I think that interplay of weakness and strength is what makes artists and what makes leaders and what makes writers and what makes anyone who does things in the world good. That's what makes them good, is that interplay of weakness and strength that's projected out into the field. And I think it's horrible that Scientologists can't see that. And not only that, they don't want anything to do with it. They just want the good. You know what I mean? And it's a false good. It's a fake good.
There are a lot of promises made,
yeah,
as you're going up the bridge.
Totally, yeah. A lot of promises that are totally divorced from reality. And again, and if this was totally Hubbard's responsibility, then shame on him. But I mean, for me, it's like, I don't know how the whole thing evolved, and I don't know how the whole thing was structured and how it became that way. But I mean, yeah, I mean, it's crazy. You know what I mean? I mean, they're basically selling God. I mean, they're basically selling indulgences. They're doing something very similar what the Catholic Church did prior to Luther. You know what I mean? And they're selling freedom. They're selling forgiveness. They're selling things that have to do with the inner life, with the spiritual life. And that is just so wrong, and it's so sick, and it's so sad. It's sad. You know what I mean? One of the reasons why I'm speaking out, and one of the reasons why I've offered myself for different interviews, is because I don't want what happened to me to ever happen to anybody again. And there's no reason why it should be, because people can look in my eyes and see if I'm an honest person or not, and see if what I'm saying in this interview or other interviews, just by my tone of voice and my inflection and what I'm saying, if it's true or not. I know what I'm saying is 100% factual. It's my experience. I lived it, but I also objectively saw it. So I have this. A lot of people who criticize Scientology has never been here and actually been through it. You know what I mean? So I've seen it. I've read about it, but I've lived it too. I've actually been in the room when there's 10 people trying to get money from you. I've been in the L's hallway at the Fort Harrison Hotel and did my L's. So I think I'm speaking from a place of experience and speaking from a place of authenticity. I would never, ever, ever in a million years wish what I experienced in anybody, my worst enemy, or anyone even remotely close to that. I think what happened to me definitely made me stronger as a human being, and it made me stronger by like totally crushing me and totally, killing me. You know what I mean? Like when I left Scientology in February of 2010, I mean, I felt suicidal. I felt like I felt so destroyed as a human being, and I felt so betrayed by people who supposedly I trusted, that it's really hard to actually verbalize the feeling that I had. And it's like this feeling of helplessness. It's a feeling of total alienation. It's a feeling of not being able to communicate. Like, I can remember my mom saying to me, like, "What's wrong?" And it's just like you can't even begin to express and relate the type of experience I went through, because it would be so over her head that she couldn't even possibly. I mean, yeah, I'm not saying she hasn't been through her things, but like the level of the betrayal by a religious organization that I experienced, for me, it was really hard to believe that other people could experience that. But then the more you talk about it, you realize people do experience different things like this, It's interesting, I don't, I really like when I was kind of reading about people who have been through similar experiences, whether it's Scientology or other thing, one of the things that I really identified a lot was with people like abuse victims. You know what I mean? I really identified with that experience of being like totally helpless and betrayed and all these things, because I really felt like, they basically took all this money from me and then just kicked me off the side of the road and had no caring for me at all as like a human being. Like I was an object to them. I had become objectified, and my money had become objectified, and my soul had become objectified. You know what I mean? And I think that was, really hard. I heard a great line one time. It says, a thief says to you, "Give me your money or your life." Scientology says to you, "Give me your money and your life." And I always identify with that.
How did you pull yourself out of that depression after you left?
I was in it for a long time, man. I was pretty much unable to work. I was unable to unable to really physically move, you know, because that's something that's really important to me, is movement of the body. I'd been a professional athlete and, you know, studied yoga for a long time. So I was unable to move. I was unable to, you know, interact with like old friends. I felt like the scarring I had gone through, like it was just like, wow, like I'm like a totally different person now, and like I feel like I can't even talk to these people that I had been with. But I think it's just a process. Like I just kind of was just in it for a while. I mean, really, I didn't do anything. I just was kind of depressed for a while, you know. And then, you know, I think even now, you know, a couple of years later, I mean, yeah, I definitely have days now, you know what I mean, where that experience definitely still affects me. I mean, you know, I'm still trying to get my money back from these people, you know, still to this day. So, I mean, that definitely affects me because in some way I'm still connected to these guys, you know what I mean? And I want nothing to do with them. You know, I want to be as far away from Scientology as possible, you know?
How much money did you spend in Scientology?
$350,000 in 1 year. I donated. Yeah, and that is not just auditing. That's, you know, human rights campaigns and all this money that I donated to the cause, you know what I mean, in addition to actually paying for auditing. Hubbard says really, really clearly that if you leave the organization within 90 days and demand money back, you have to get paid back. Now, I demanded it the day I left. You know what I mean? I knew that this whole thing was a total, like, I was like, I'm done. You know what I mean? And I went to the point, Mark, when I said, listen, you know something? You don't have to give me all my money back. Just be fair. Give me something that's reasonable and whatever. I don't even care. Even though I wanted all my money back and I felt like I deserved all my money back, and I felt like I deserved my money back and then some for what they did to me, I was just like, listen, just give me a fair settlement and I'll just, whatever, you know? And they offered me like $25,000 or something like that, you know what I mean? So I felt like so insulted and so, I mean, not only that, they're just blatantly disregarding the words of their own guy that founded the religion. So I've been actively trying to, get back this money for a while now, you know, and it's like every time it's like the new thing. They refuse to communicate with me. They refuse to have any type of honest discourse with me. And it's really interesting. One of the first people I talked to when I left was the chaplain at Flag. Paul Greenwood was his name. And he said to me, he's like, Brian, you should get every penny back. You should get every penny back, and I'm going to write a report saying that you should get all your money back. And the next time I called him 2 weeks later, he hung up the phone on me. Wouldn't talk to me anymore. Apparently, he probably said, give him his money back, and they said, don't say that again, you know.
Now that you've been speaking out, have you felt repercussions from Scientology?
No. Nope. I haven't felt anything. And to be honest with you, I have absolutely no fear of any repercussions. I could care less if they do anything to me. I have absolutely no fear of the Church of Scientology. And I think that's another reason why I want people to know there's nothing to be afraid of. Even if they do something, it's not going to do anything to you. You know what I mean? And I feel like if they act out against me, it just makes them look totally ridiculous and look totally foolish. You know what I mean? I have done nothing wrong to Scientology. Nothing. I was involved in this organization for a year. I respected them. I went by all their rules. They misrepresented and broke every single promise they made to me. And all I said was, I didn't even ask for all my money back. I said, just give me something back that's fair, and I never want to talk to you again, never see you again. I don't want to speak badly about you in public. I don't want to do anything. I want to live my life. And they couldn't do that. So, I mean, me speaking to you today is a result of them not being honest, period. I'm just calling them on the carpet for what they've done to me, and them breaking the fundamental principles of what Hubbard says to do. You know what I mean? It's like, if Hubbard says if people aren't happy with services, you pay them back immediately. And they have totally disrespected and disregarded that. Scientology tries to criminalize whistleblowing. You know, they try to make the act of whistleblowing wrong. And, you know, we live in a world today that is becoming integrated and corporatized, and all these different things are happening where whistleblowing is so important. It's so essential, not just in Scientology, but on a government level, on a social level, on a corporate level. So whistleblowers are people who are seeing things that are happening that are wrong, that have to make people aware of what's happening. And that is such an important act. And for Scientology as a religion to have the audacity to make that wrong and make criminalizing and criminalize the act of whistleblowing is so repulsive and reprehensible, I can't even begin to put into words. Because whistleblowing is what we as a society need. We need more on all, not just Scientology, but all different sectors of life. And I think people who have the courage, whether it's Scientology or in a government or anywhere, to stand up and say, hey, the power in this organization, what you're doing is wrong. It's an act of heroism and an act that should be applauded and supported, not destroyed and disparaged.